So welcome everybody. We are so glad you are here with us. I'm Victoria Solomon. I'm the Community Development Educator with Extension in Greene County. And today we're really going to be going into the results from the annual water testing program. We are so excited to have you join us. While this program is open to anyone in Greene County, I do want to give a quick shout out to our towns that really partnered with us to kick things off. So this year we partnered with the towns of Brooklyn and Mount Pleasant. And of course, we did a lot in Greene County with Greene County Extension. A couple quick things about Zoom. So we will be posting this recording on YouTube for the educational portion. We want to make sure it is accessible. And so for the recorded portion, we'll have everyone have their video off for recording. If you have a specific question, feel free to put that in the chat to Kevin or myself or Joe, and we can ask that. We will have opportunity for sort of one-to-one questions at the end, or if they're generalized questions, we'll have that at the end. That won't be recorded. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to go over the results.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and more importantly, for sending in a water sample. There's really two main reasons we do these programs. One is to help all of you better understand the water quality that you might be drinking from your well. But two, by testing as a large community, we get a much better picture of groundwater quality in any given area. In the case of this year, it's portions of Greene County that we're working in. My name, as Victoria mentioned, is Kevin Masarik. I'm a groundwater education specialist with UW-Extension, based out of the UW-Stevens Point campus. A lot of my work involves groundwater education, and a lot of that takes place through these types of drinking or well water testing programs. So again, thank you all for joining us and being involved in this program and opportunity. Throughout the presentation, we will be displaying a series of maps to give people an idea of how the well water quality varies throughout the community. We won't be displaying information at a level that lets you see, let's say, an individual parcel or an individual property's well water quality, but we will be giving kind of a generic view of water quality at a very high level, just so you can kind of see how variable groundwater might be where you live. For this particular program, again, we focused on the towns of Brooklyn and Mount Pleasant. So orient yourself to this Greene County map. We're going to be looking at this upper right or the northeastern quadrant, which was the focus of this year's testing program. Just to give you an idea of where in those towns or where within Greene County we receive samples from, this map is showing a number 1, where that number indicates basically a quarter section where we received a sample. In some cases, we might see a number 2 or number 3, and that just indicates the number of samples we received from any given unit area. So again, you can kind of see the samples clustered mainly in the town of Brooklyn, town of Mount Pleasant, but also a handful of samples from other locations within Greene County. So today, what I'd like to cover in our brief time together here, just getting everybody on the same page, talking through a little bit about groundwater basics and where your well water comes from. We'll talk about the role of well construction and maintaining sanitary water, but also determining certain aspects of water quality. The main reason you're probably all here is to learn more about what those test results mean, and that'll be the main focus of today's presentation. But through that data that we've collected, we can use that information to give a little bit broader look at general groundwater quality throughout the two towns. And then lastly, as Victoria mentioned, if you have questions about water quality issues or problems, we'll try to answer any questions that people have about improving well water quality should there be an issue or should there be a problem. The great news is that the vast majority of people in Greene County and Wisconsin have access to great water. In the event that there is something either health related with the water quality or aesthetically related, we'll do our best to try and answer those questions for you. When we talk about where people's well water comes from, it's really important to get some basic understanding of groundwater, because that's the source of rural Wisconsinites' water. Well water is all going to be groundwater, and wells are just vertical holes in the ground that those holes eventually reach a point where all the empty spaces in the soil or all the cracks in the rock are filled with water, and that's our groundwater. It's not an underground lake, it's not an underground river, it's just the water that occupies the empty spaces in the soil or the rock below our feet. And the different soils or the different rocks that water is stored or transported in are really important for determining things like how quickly groundwater moves, but also how easily groundwater can become contaminated. If we think of large fractures or cracks in rock, if you drive along, major roadways and see road cuts, sometimes you'll see water cascading out of rocks after large rain event or maybe after a snowmelt period. And water moving through large cracks or fractures just doesn't get filtered nearly as well as water that might be moving through sandstone or sand and gravel. So the different properties of rocks are really important for determining, again, how quickly groundwater moves, but also how easily those things that happen at the surface can get down into the water where we're pulling our well water from. And then the rock material itself can also impart different impurities that we'll talk about throughout the program today as well. The other aspect to groundwater is that it's always moving very slowly through those empty spaces in the soil and the rock, but it's moving from recharge areas, those areas where water can soak into the ground, and it's moving to what we call discharge areas, which are typically going to be a nearby stream, river, or lake, is going to be the primary discharge locations for our groundwater. Groundwaters and surface waters are really closely connected, and our groundwater is all destined to be surface water at some point. So if we want to know what direction our groundwater is moving in, take the highest point on the landscape and then try to locate the nearest river or stream. And that probably gives you a pretty good idea of the general groundwater flow direction in your vicinity. I mentioned groundwater is stored in the soils or the geologic materials below our feet. We call those materials aquifers. Those are the geologic formations that store our groundwater. And what you'll notice if we look at the state of Wisconsin in the lower right is that we have this layered cake geology, different types of materials that we rely on as aquifers or to access groundwater. And in the case of Greene County, it's going to be mainly sand and gravels that were left behind by the glaciers. In parts of western Greene County, there might be more people relying on sandstones, even some dolomite material. Dolomite, if you're unfamiliar with that term, is just a name for a certain type of limestone or carbonate rock that would be very similar to that upper left picture you see with the cracks and the fissures where the water is moving through those cracks and those fissures. So there are parts of Greene County with that type of geology that might make it a little bit more susceptible to certain forms of contamination. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is soil is a really good filter. So areas that have thicker soil deposits offer a little bit more filtering and protection to groundwater than those areas where the soil layer is thin or absent. This map right here just gives us some indication. If we remove the soil, if we remove the unconsolidated materials, what would be the first type of bedrock that we would encounter? And in the towns of Brooklyn and Mount Pleasant, it's going to be mainly, different carbonate rocks, and in a lot of areas where sandstone is the primary rock unit that we would encounter underneath the soil or underneath the sand and gravels left behind by the glaciers. So those are just some basics of groundwater that will set the stage for helping us interpret and learn why water quality might be different throughout the county. Transitioning into water quality results, when we talk about water, we refer to water as a universal solvent because it has a great ability to dissolve stuff that it comes in contact with. So as much as we all want pure water, pure H2O, in the environment, groundwater in particular is never pure H2O. It's always going to have impurities depending on the types of rocks or minerals that water flows through, the types of land use where that water recharges or infiltrates, even the types of plumbing or packaging that water is stored or transported in will impart different impurities into our water. Really important to note that if we ever do find impurities that are a health concern, we have treatment technologies that are really pretty efficient at taking a lot of those unwanted impurities out of our water and either making it safer to drink, or in the case of aesthetic concerns, maybe making it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. When we look at all the results that people may have run, there's the series of different packages that were offered. There was the homeowner package, the metals package, and then there was a DAC screen. The majority of people chose to have all three packages run, and that's great. You will know more about your well water than probably 95% of Wisconsin well owners, given the extensive set of analyses that you had performed. But just noting that not all of the tests that were run are necessarily important for health reasons. There's obviously tests that are important to health, those outlined in that first column. But then there's other tests that we do because they contribute to taste, color, and odor issues. Many of the things that are health related aren't necessarily things that we can see, taste, or smell. But there are certain things like iron or manganese in the water that will cause staining or discoloration or maybe off-putting odors that people often are curious about and want to test for, especially if they're trying to decide on appropriate treatment for those particular water quality concerns. And then there's this other category of tests that we call other important indicator tests. Things like the saturation index tell us things like, how is that water going to interact with the plumbing system? If the water is corrosive, there might be an issue or a concern about pinhole leak development or elevated levels of things like copper or lead. If the water, the saturation index shows really high levels of scale formation, then it might provide some evidence or indication of scaling and suggest the likelihood that somebody would benefit from maybe something like a water softener. So these are the different categories of tests with the specific tests listed underneath that would have been run in these tests or these samples. When we talk about health concerns related to water, just note that there's really two different categories. There's acute effects. Those health effects usually seen within a short time of exposure to a contaminant or a substance. Examples of acute effects might be things like bacteria or viruses. Think foodborne illnesses where shortly after being exposed to something like salmonella or E. coli in food, people would start to develop symptoms, usually some sort of gastrointestinal illness or disease, maybe a couple days after being exposed to that type of bacteria or virus. There's this other category of health effects related to water, which is characterized as chronic effects. that are going to result from exposure to a substance over a long or extended period of time. So examples of elements that might be related to chronic health effects would be arsenic or pesticides, where we know, above certain levels, those compounds can increase the risk of developing health complications from that type of environmental exposure. Drinking the water once or twice or for a short period of time, not likely to cause health complications from that environmental exposure. But if those elements are in the water at certain levels, and that's going to be somebody's primary drinking water source for years or decades while they're in the home, then there's probably some benefit to reducing their long-term exposure to those elements in their drinking water. So really important, anytime you purchase a new home or have a new well drilled, those are really great times to have the water tested to ensure that you can take appropriate measures to reduce risks related to some of these chronic health effects. And just to put that into perspective, drinking water quality is only one part of an individual's total risk. So having something like arsenic in your water, even at levels above the standard, doesn't necessarily guarantee somebody's going to become sick from that water. It just, again, means that it's associated with an increased risk. And if we look specifically at arsenic, 1,000 people drinking water with concentrations greater than 0.010 milligrams per liter for years or decades, we might expect 3 out of 1,000 people to develop some sort of chronic health complication, usually some sort or form of cancer from that environmental exposure. Some people might look at 3 in 1,000 and say that's not a huge risk. I'm not that concerned. Other people might look at 3 in 1,000 and say, that's just not a risk I'm willing to take. So I'm going to install some sort of water treatment device to ensure that me and my family are not, at that increased risk related to that water quality or environmental exposure. And the reason we go through a lot of this information is because there is a distinct difference between private and public water supplies. When you live on a public water system, that system is regularly tested. And if those test results show anything wrong, the water utility is required to meet drinking water standards. So if it exceeds a health standard, they're required to treat that water to ensure that when somebody turns on their faucet at home, that water is safe to drink. Private wells don't have that same benefit, right? Like, you are your own water utility manager, whether you realize that or not. So it's really up to each individual to determine which tests they're going to have performed, how regularly they're going to perform them, and if those results show an issue, what those next steps might be. You are under no obligation, should any of the results show a problem, you are under no obligation to take corrective measures, but we do want to make sure that you have the appropriate information to know what the appropriate measures might be should you want to take some sort of corrective action. So that's really the main goal of today's program, is to give you the information and the tools to manage your private water supply in terms of expectations that you have for your own water quality. Transitioning into your actual results, hopefully everybody received their results in the mail. It would have been accompanied by some interpretive guides or interpretive information. We're going to go through the most important tests, and then any tests that are not covered can be, referenced, or you can consult that interpretive guide to give you some background information on what each of the tests means, as well as what those safe levels, if there's health concerns, are going to be. Coliform bacteria is probably the most important test to perform regularly on a private well. This is giving you a measure of the sanitary integrity of the well water system. The DNR, which manages the well code, that well code is based on this premise that a properly constructed well should be able to provide bacteria-free water without treatment. So an annual bacteria test is kind of like going to the doctor for a checkup. It's trying to distinguish, is my well capable of producing sanitary water? And even though coliform bacteria generally don't cause illness on their own, we do urge people to take some additional precautions should they detect coliform bacteria, because we normally don't find them at significant concentrations in groundwater. So when we do find them in a well, the concern is that there's a pathway for surface water or some sort of breach in that well water system that might be allowing harmful bacteria or other viruses into that well water system. If we ever do detect coliform bacteria, it's really important to highlight that we also check those samples for E. coli. E. coli would represent, confirmation that the source of that bacteria originated from some sort of human or animal source. And that's a much more serious situation when we detect E. coli in somebody's well water sample, because E. coli on its own can be harmful to health, but the presence of human or animal waste makes it much more likely that we're going to find things like Salmonella, Campylobacter, Cryptosporidia, Giardia. Those are all different types of viruses or bacteria that would be much more commonly found in water that contains human or animal waste. So E. coli is a good screening tool for some of these other harmful pathogens that we might sometimes find in well water. So any detectable level of E. coli, we definitely would not want people using that for drinking and cooking until the source of that E. coli could be identified and the pathway that bacteria had into the well was fixed or corrected. When we look at how bacteria get into the well, a lot of times the first thing we look at is the well construction itself. So the well on the upper left is showing what we generally consider to be a good looking, well-maintained rural well to look like. You'll notice it's got a vermin-proof cap. The casing extends, at least 12 to 14 inches above the ground surface. It's relatively free and clear of obstructions, which might conceal small animals like rabbits or provide habitat for insects that we don't necessarily want congregating around our drinking water source. Leaving it free and clear also makes it really easy for a well driller or a pump installer, should they need to come out and service that well, makes it really easy for them to be able to access that water supply to make sure they can do their work effectively. The other pictures that you see are all wells that did detect coliform and in some cases E. coli bacteria. And it's really not hard to see how bacteria might have gotten into some of those wells. Starting at the upper right, the well with the cracked cap. Anytime it rains or you can see the leaves around the well because it's fall, anything that might drop into that well has a potential to carry bacteria into the well with it. The picture to the left of it is a well that had a cap, but it was easily removed. It wasn't affixed in any way, didn't require any special tools to remove that cap and look into the well. And what you're looking at is a series of small earwigs that have inhabited that casing. And we know that earwigs can not only contain coliform bacteria in their stomach or in their gut material, but also E. coli bacteria sometimes as well. The other pictures, one of them shows a yard hydrant. That yard hydrant doesn't have proper backflow prevention. So anytime they use the yard hydrant, some of that water in that hose has the potential to be back siphoned directly back into that well out of that hose. And we know hoses are kind of breeding grounds for bacteria and other organisms. So that was a thing that was quickly identified as a potential source of coliform bacteria to that person's well. Other things to think about, how closely you allow pets to congregate or where you put their pens in proximity to your drinking water is important. Even where you put bird feeders or bird houses might be important. If those bird feeders or bird houses are located, in close proximity or some cases directly above the well, those are not things we want to encourage because of the birds and where they might defecate. We don't necessarily want in the immediate vicinity of our drinking water source. And then other things to look for on rural properties are things like old unused wells. That's that diagram in the lower left showing an old dug well. And anytime it rains or if there's flooding, those open holes represent direct conduits of surface water into the groundwater. And if we don't properly fill and seal those old unused wells, they can continue to contaminate the groundwater, where we may now be relying on a new well to access the groundwater. But if we don't properly fill and seal those old unused wells, they might continue to contaminate new wells that we might have drilled, either on your property or on neighboring properties. Also consider any outbuildings or yard hydrants or other water fixtures, especially on farm properties. If you have livestock and livestock waters, if those are hooked up to wells and don't have the proper backflow prevention, there might be some issues with cross-contamination that should be investigated or looked into. And then the last thing with bacteria to consider is the groundwater itself and other aspects of well water or well construction that we might not always think about. Do deeper wells mean better water quality? In some cases, yes, but probably what's as important to consider in terms of the well depth is that casing depth. So in this diagram, which might be very typical of parts of Greene County where we have thin soils overlaying cracked or fractured rock, and in this situation, the well might only be cased to the top of the water table, we can see water from the sinkhole has a direct pathway into this well. This whole lower section of the well is open to the aquifer, and those sinkhole cracks or fractures intersect it pretty readily. In this situation here, the well depth is exactly the same, but we've extended that casing, that metal pipe, we've extended deeper into the water table. And in this diagram, we've sealed off that upper portion of the aquifer, which makes it much more difficult for that water from that sinkhole to reach our water supply. So again, as much as we talk about well depth, casing depth, that metal pipe that sticks out of the ground, also extends a certain distance below the ground. And the distance that casing extends into the water table is as important as well depth in determining where your water comes from and potentially, how likely it is to be contaminated by bacteria from certain geologic features like sinkholes. If you ever do detect bacteria, we usually recommend using alternative source of water for drinking and cooking until you can retest and ensure that bacteria has been eliminated from the well. If a retest confirms the presence of bacteria, then the next step is to identify where it might be coming from. So any sort of sanitary defect like the well cap, cracks in the casing. Once those are fixed, well disinfection is usually the next step to get that well back in good working order. And then you want to retest following disinfection to make sure that procedure was successful. For reoccurring bacteria problems, if you're testing annually for bacteria, as we'd recommend, and every year it's coming back positive for bacteria, it might be an indication that the well, the age of the well just isn't it wasn't drilled up to modern standards and might be allowing some of that contamination to take place. It might be the geology of the area itself, in which case looking at drilling deeper or casing deeper might be good long-term solutions to ensuring a more sanitary water supply for that particular home. Transitioning into hardness. So hardness is another thing that we tested for. This is a measure of calcium and magnesium in the water. Hardness, calcium and magnesium are actually beneficial to health. So there's nothing wrong with drinking water that contains high levels of hardness. But too much hardness causes aesthetic issues such as scaling, soap scum buildup. People with hard water tend to use more detergent. And if you have an electric hot water heater, that scale buildup might decrease the water heater efficiency over time. So we generally consider anything greater than 200 milligrams per liter of hardness to be hard water. There's just kind of this ideal range between about 150 and 200. And then if there's too little hardness, soft water is problematic because it can be a little bit more aggressive or corrosive. If we look at the test results for Mount Pleasant and Brooklyn, the different colored dots correspond to different concentrations of hardness. And what we see is that the vast majority, more than 85% of the well samples that were submitted would be classified as hard water. And then there's some that are, over 400 that are, even, significantly more hardness than the average concentrations that we'd likely find. Why knowing the level is important is because if you have a water softener, knowing the hardness concentration of the water itself helps you set that water softener to the appropriate level and ensure that you're not using more softening salt than you absolutely need. That gets to another point about hardness. If you're wondering why you may use so much more softening salt than a neighbor or a family member, a lot of times it's related to the starting concentration of hardness in your water to begin with. So somebody with 400 milligrams per liter is going to be using twice as much softener salt as a person with 200 milligrams per liter of hardness. So hard water we know is pretty pervasive throughout Greene County. Water softening, as mentioned, is the appropriate treatment for water hardness. Know that it's removing calcium and magnesium. It does add back in sodium. It replaces those elements with sodium. So if your doctor were to say, limit your sodium intake, drinking softened water can sometimes represent a significant amount of sodium. For most individuals, that's not the case. But for those that should be on really strict low sodium diets, sodium added from the water softening process might be something to be concerned about. That is also the reason why a lot of people will bypass their primary drinking water from the softening process, is because one, they don't want the added sodium, but two, that calcium and magnesium often give water a little bit better taste that people tend to prefer. So it's very common for a lot of homes to actually bypass the cold water kitchen faucet from that softening process. Other tests in that homeowner package include alkalinity, conductivity, and pH. These are overall water quality tests that we use to calculate what we call saturation index. And that saturation index is just a measure of, is the water going to have a greater tendency to corrode, or is it more likely to form scale? Negative numbers would indicate corrosivity. Positive numbers would indicate scale formation. Please note that if your total hardness was much less than your alkalinity value, let's say your alkalinity is 200 and your hardness value is 20 or less, that tells us that that water most likely passed through your water softener. And in those situations, the saturation index would not be an accurate representation of what the actual value might be. The next set of tests that we're going to cover are things that are related to human activity or land use. So anything we do on the land surface has the potential to impact water quality below. And most private wells are probably accessing water that originated within, a quarter or half mile of the well itself. So if we're trying to get a sense of what's impacting our water quality, you could pull up Google Maps or Google Earth, draw a half mile or a mile buffer around that well, and that gives you a pretty good idea of the land uses that are impacting your well water quality. And nitrate is a really good indicator of land use impacts. There's health effects associated with nitrate. As a result, it's a very common test for people to have performed, particularly those that might have infants at home or households where there may be a woman who is pregnant or trying to become pregnant. Those are very susceptible populations that would benefit from knowing the nitrate concentration or the nitrate level. Sources of nitrate to groundwater include agricultural nitrogen fertilizers, nitrogen lawn fertilizers, septic systems, even those that are properly functioning, will release nitrate from the breakdown of human waste. And then animal wastes and manure that might be spread on the landscape break down and release nitrate that can sometimes find its way into groundwater as well. When we're interpreting those nitrate levels, anything less than 2 is considered to be background or natural levels of nitrate in groundwater. Greater than 2 is showing impacts, and then anything greater than 10 would be in excess of drinking water standards. And we would not want infants less than 6 months of age or women who were pregnant or trying to become pregnant. We would not want them consuming water with levels greater than 10. And we also encourage everyone else to avoid long-term consumption of nitrate above those levels because of increasing research and literature to suggest health complications even to older adults or older populations, linkages to thyroid function and even certain types of cancers. When we look at the nitrate levels, what we see is there's about 12% that were less than 2 or considered natural or background levels. So most wells in the tests that were submitted for this round showed slightly elevated levels. And there were even about 23%, roughly 1 in 4 samples that exceeded that drinking water standard for nitrate. So anything greater than 10, again, we'd want to encourage those individuals to probably take some additional measures to reduce their exposure to nitrate. If we look at where the nitrate's coming from, agricultural landscapes are generally a good educated guess about the source. We apply nitrogen fertilizer either as commercial fertilizer or as animal manures and animal wastes to the landscape to help our crops grow. And it would be great if all that nitrogen were incorporated into the plant, but anything left over at the end of the growing season does have the potential to leach during the fall, winter, through the following spring, leach past the root zone of plants into our groundwater. So it's not uncommon for those areas that have more intensive agricultural activity to notice both higher concentrations of nitrate, but also higher percentages of nitrate exceedances in these types of large testing programs. If you do detect nitrate above unsafe levels, ideally we'd like to eliminate the contamination source on the land surface. That's not always possible, or even in the situations where it is, it may take years or decades to notice measurable improvement in somebody's well. So unfortunately, we're oftentimes forced with looking at short-term solutions. Those might be looking at changing the well depth or relocating the well, looking at buying or purchasing bottled water, or a lot of times people will choose to install some sort of water treatment device. Nitrate is more difficult to remove than a lot of other contaminants. So treatment for nitrate is very specific. You'd be looking at one of these three types of devices here. Either a reverse osmosis system, distillation unit, or some sort of anion exchange system. Those are the three types of systems that would be appropriate if you were specifically looking to reduce your nitrate level in your drinking water. Chloride is another test that is related to land use impacts. There's no direct health effects related to chloride, although if there's too much chloride, levels greater than 250 milligrams per liter can cause kind of a salty taste associated with that water source. Anything greater than 10 kind of indicates human activity or human impacts to that well water, that groundwater. And then sources of chloride to groundwater, again, would be fertilizers, potash fertilizers used to supply potassium. More often than not are going to also contain chloride, which plants don't readily absorb or use. Septic systems, particularly those that might have water softeners, tend to discharge quite a bit of chloride to drain fields that can end up in groundwater. And then areas near major roadways, road salt can also be a contributor or a potential source of chloride to groundwater. If we look at chloride levels, again, about 25% are at background or natural levels, and then 75% or more would show some evidence of land use impacts associated with those chloride sources. Nothing too high or too significant. Not surprising, the higher levels, here I would classify higher levels in that 50 to 100 range. Oftentimes those are in close proximity to major highways or maybe some of the more urban areas of Greene County. And I'd say that's, kind of what I'd see here in the Mount Pleasant area with those two, and even some of them in the Brooklyn area. Not unusual to see them near major roadways or county highways. Transitioning into the metals package, I'm not going to cover all the metals, but I am going to highlight the ones that I think people have the most questions about or may have the most implication for health. And starting with arsenic, arsenic is naturally occurring in the soils and the bedrock. The standard you'll see is quite small, 0.010 milligrams per liter. Health effects are chronic health effects, so result from exposure to a long or extended period of time, and not guaranteed. It's just associated with increased risks of certain types of health complications. We know that, Wisconsin has some of the highest concentrations of arsenic anywhere in the world in the Outagamie-Winnebago County area along Lake Winnebago. Less common in other parts of the state, but you do see that map of Wisconsin with Greene County showing some areas, particularly in the western portion of Greene County, where they have seen some elevated or some high levels. So it is a good test if people have never done an arsenic test before. It is a good test to do at least once on a private well. The good news is that the vast majority of water samples did not detect any arsenic. There were a few, about 1 in 5 samples that detected arsenic at levels less than that drinking water standard. In those situations, we would encourage people to test for arsenic maybe again in a year or two, just to ensure that the level of arsenic has not changed. For those that have not detected arsenic, it's highly unlikely that you ever would, because it's just probably confirmation that there's no source of arsenic in the immediate vicinity where your well is located. If we look at iron, iron is another naturally occurring impurity that we might find in groundwater. A little bit of iron may, actually benefit health. So no health considerations when we talk about iron in water, but most people find it objectionable because it's what causes that reddish brown staining, or might cause that metallic taste for those that are using the water as a drinking water source. Too much iron can also increase the likelihood of what we call iron bacteria. If you ever notice kind of a sliminess to the water, maybe there's an oily sheen or an oily film on the water that sits in the toilet tank or in the toilet bowl, or your water has a off-putting odor, like a sewage smell, maybe a rotten egg odor, or it smells like garbage. Those are indications that your well might be infested with what we call iron bacteria. Iron bacteria is generally not a concern to health, but it's kind of a nuisance bacteria that can be controlled through disinfection or chlorination of that well water supply. Those issues, those staining issues, taste issues, are all going to be much more likely as the concentration of iron goes up. And once you reach about 0.3 milligrams per liter, that's generally the level at which people might choose to pursue some sort of water treatment to reduce iron in their home's household water supply. Copper is another test that we performed in that metals package. This does have some health implications. Unlike the other elements we looked at, the source of copper is actually going to be the plumbing system itself. So homes with copper plumbing, especially the water that sits in contact with those pipes for a long or extended period of time, can sometimes dissolve some high levels of copper. When that level of copper gets above 1.3 milligrams per liter, you might notice some minor health effects or health implications from that copper in the water. Those health effects might be things like stomach cramps, diarrhea, vomiting or nausea, especially in young children or infants who might not have had a lot of exposure to copper in drinking water. Similar to copper is lead, in that the source of that lead is going to be the household plumbing system. Prior to 1985, lead solder was used commonly to join together or solder copper plumbing. Lead is also a component of brass fixtures. So water sitting in contact with these plumbing components can sometimes dissolve unsafe levels of lead. Notice the concentration is quite small, 0.015 milligrams per liter. That's because there's no known health effects or no known health benefits to lead in the human body. And the more we can reduce our exposure to lead, the better off we'll be. I have that picture of the child drinking out of the hose. The other thing I'll mention is that lead is often used as a stabilizer for a lot of plastics or rubber components. So if we think of a hose baking in the hot summer sun, that's deteriorating the material of that hose and probably making it more likely for whatever material that hose is made of to leach into that water system. So for that reason, probably not a great idea to encourage children to drink out of hoses. And anything we can do to reduce our exposure to lead and copper, I think the healthier we will probably be. As serious as a health concern as lead is, fortunately, there's a fairly simple solution, which is just to let the water run for a minute or two before using that water for drinking or cooking. The metals package, the way we design those instructions, we ask you to take a first draw sample what is the concentration of those elements after that water has been left to sit for a long or extended period of time. And if you let that water run for a minute or two, you're flushing out that stagnant water. That water is not going to have enough contact time to reach those same levels. So again, if you detected lead or copper in your water sample, probably best just to get into the habit of letting the water run for a minute or two before you'd use that water for drinking or cooking. The last test package that we offered was a screen for certain pesticides. There's literally hundreds of compounds, different insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, that are used and permitted for use in the state of Wisconsin. It would be cost prohibitive to test for all of them. So we use kind of research that's conducted by the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection to try and narrow down which tests are most important for people to consider if they're going to look for pesticides in their water. The most frequently detected pesticides in Wisconsin are going to be allichlor, metolachlor, and atrazine. And atrazine is going to be the one that when we find water quality that is unsafe because of pesticides, it's more often than not going to be atrazine, which exceeds health-related standards for pesticide compounds. So that's why we offer what we call the DAC screen. DAC stands for diaminochlorotriazine, which is a breakdown component of atrazine and other similar types of pesticides on the market. So atrazine, simazine, propazine, cyanazine, all of those will break down and release diaminochlorotriazine. So we feel that DACT is a great screening tool for individuals to understand what is the likelihood that their water exceeds a drinking water standard for atrazine. And that atrazine standard is 3 parts per billion, which is the combination of parent atrazine with all of its metabolites, DACT or diaminochlorotriazine being one of those. If we look at those results, what we see, about half of the people that chose to have that DAC screen run, about half of them did not detect any atrazine breakdown components. There were about half that did detect some minor levels. There was even one that was greater than 1 part per billion, but there were none of them that exceeded that health-related standard. If the level is below 2, it's highly unlikely that your water supply is unsafe with respect to pesticides. So I think this slide is kind of a mixed bag of good news and not so good news. I'd say the good news is that all of the water samples are probably safe to drink with respect to pesticides. The bad news is that there are some minor residues being detected in about half of the wells that submitted samples. If looking at improving water quality, we talked, nitrate, ideally we want to eliminate the sources of contamination. Short term though, there's often some intermediate steps that people might have to take, which would look at involving things like bottled water or maybe some sort of water treatment device, which tends to be a lot of times the most convenient and cost-effective solution for homeowners to pursue. Where do we go from here? Victoria mentioned that this program is offered, around Greene County. They choose or they try to hit every quadrant of Greene County once every 4 years, but you don't need to wait for that 4-year mark to test your well. You can test your well annually, or we'd recommend testing your well annually for things like bacteria or nitrate, particularly for those samples that might be approaching that 10 milligram per liter standard. If your nitrate level was greater than 5 and you have not checked for pesticides. That might be something else you want to pursue doing next time, or in the period of time between now and the next time Greene County chooses to offer this program. And that goes or holds true for arsenic as well. If you haven't checked for arsenic, consider testing for that again next time. If arsenic was present, you may want to check on those levels again, just to make sure that they haven't increased or changed over time. And then lastly, I do want to reiterate and give our gratitude to the towns of Brooklyn and Mount Pleasant for assisting with this program and offering this program to its residents. I also want to extend my sincere thanks to Victoria Solomon and Joe Bonnell for their help in arranging this program through the Greene County Extension Office. My contact information is listed here. We will have some time for people to ask questions after Victoria gives her concluding remarks. But should people have questions after tonight, feel free to reach out by phone or by email with any questions that you might have that might not have been answered in tonight's presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Victoria, for closing remarks and moderating our question and answer period.
Yes, so thank you so much, Kevin. Much appreciated. This is a lot of really great data. I'm going to end the recording now, and we'll have time for question and answer.